throughout the day. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
We are continuing this morning, as we said in our study of 1 Corinthians. We're in chapter 14. We've been talking the last few weeks as we began in chapter 12 and continued on in chapter 13, talking about spiritual gifts in relation to the church there at Corinth and all the things that we can learn as well from discussing what Paul was telling them in these chapters. This morning we're going to go into more how this, looking at what benefits the congregation. And as Rodney prayed in his prayer, he kind of hit one of the key points, or probably the key point that we're going to stress this morning, and that is edification, what builds up the church, what is the purpose of us meeting together this morning, and the things that we are doing, what who lead prayers, who lead the singing, those who speak, what is the purpose of that? And of course, as Rodney said, it's to build up, to edify. And so we're going to be looking at that and kind of stressing those things, several times throughout our study this morning. In chapter 14, as we said, Paul continues to help the Corinthians to understand the proper place of spiritual gifts. And that's important for us because, as we've said the last few weeks, there's a lot of false doctrine being promoted in reference to spiritual gifts. And so we need to properly understand what is or was the place of spiritual gifts. And so that's what Paul is trying to do for the Corinthians here. And so we see that rather than being used properly and for the good of the whole church, for the edification of the congregation there in Corinth, they were being used maybe as a way to raise someone's self-esteem or maybe place themselves above others in the congregation. And we see that there's a lot of issues going on surrounding that. All through the book of Corinthians, we see that there were some bad attitudes there. And, Paul's trying to correct those things. And so here we're specifically looking at spiritual gifts and what that was doing. As we said, the first three chapters, these three chapters, not the first three chapters, these three chapters, 12, 13, and 14, is where Paul is kind of dealing with that. And kind of a way of review, we see, in chapter 12, he was talking about the right attitude toward gifts. If the Godhead was unified in giving miraculous gifts to the early Christians, the Corinthians should have been unified in their reception and use of them. And so that's kind of a broad summary of what he was getting at there. These gifts were given by a unified Godhead. They were given for purposes. It was nothing really that the Corinthians had done themselves. It was a gift, so to speak. They didn't earn them. That they were given to them, and so they needed to have the proper attitude toward that. Last week in chapter 13, it was dealing with, of course, love, but in dealing with love, we're looking at he kind of showed them the duration of spiritual gifts. Why is love superior to miraculous gifts? Well, love abides forever. Spiritual gifts do not. They were temporary, whereas love is more important. Love is more sustaining, so to speak. And even today, we have love. You look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Love never fails, but whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. And so this concept here is very important for us as we look and seek to understand spiritual gifts, because we probably wouldn't have to drive very far up and down this highway to come to a denomination that probably would be claimed to be performing spiritual gifts even today. And so we need to understand how that when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. And so these things were temporary, they had a purpose, and compared to love, love never fails. But these things eventually would go away. And then as we get into chapter 14, we're looking there at the regulation of the gifts, these spiritual gifts. The Corinthian assembly, from all indications, seemed to be a very chaotic place. Things were not being done in order. We discussed, Rodney led us through a study of the Lord's Supper and how that there was really seemingly no organization as to how they were partaking of that and coming together. They weren't coming together all in one place. Some were doing it here, And as we get into this idea of spiritual gifts, it seems like even that was adding to the chaos there, and things were not being done in order. They had a lack of love and respect for one another. They were trying to promote themselves and not really possessing a proper love for the fellow brethren. And there was a misuse and misunderstanding of miraculous or spiritual gifts. And so we'll get in and begin our study of chapter 14 today. I'm sure we're not going to finish, or I know we're not going to finish it today, but hopefully we'll get through the first several verses and look at things in relation to those verses. So let's begin by reading the first 5 verses of chapter 14. And as he concludes, what he's talking about, or what he was talking about there in chapter 13, as far as love, he begins chapter 14 saying, "Pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. For he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mystery. But he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. I wish you all spoke with tongues, but even more that you prophesied. For he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks with tongues, unless indeed he interprets, that the church may receive edification." So here we see in these 5 verses, the church receives edification from prophecy. While love is the greatest gift, we also see here that spiritual gifts were not useless. There in that first verse it says, "Pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy." So there was nothing wrong with this desire to have spiritual gifts. But what was the motivation behind that desire? Was it to edify, or was it to self-promote? And that's what we're going to discuss this morning. Spiritual gifts are good, but why do you want that spiritual gift? What's the use of this gift? And so there's, I think, where we see the disconnect there with the Corinthians is they were wanting these gifts so that they could use them for their own uses. You look at chapter 12 and verse 31. You remember we read there, "But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I will show you a more excellent way." So as he was finishing up there in chapter 12, even there he's telling them to desire the best gifts. So there was nothing wrong with that desire to have a spiritual gift, but why do we want that desire? Or why do we want that gift? Even today, we may desire to be able to lead singing well. Well, why would we want to have that ability? Would it be so that we can promote ourselves or seem important in the congregation here? Or would it be so that we might have that ability to encourage the congregation or to lead a song service that would teach and exhort and edify the congregation? What's our reason behind desiring that ability? Same with preaching or leading prayers or things like that. Are we going to use those things in a way that's going to edify, or are we going to do that solely for the purpose of self-glorification? And so we can learn a lot of lessons from these passages as well. So from what we gather from Paul's writing here as we go through chapter 12, it seems that the Corinthians were putting a lot of emphasis on those people who were able to speak in tongues. It seems for some reason they were putting these people, or they were trying to act, the people who were able to do this were acting like that this was a more important gift. And so since they were able to speak in tongues, then they were on kind of a different level than other people. And so it seems that Paul is going to go through and try to help them understand while the tongues in this congregation were not necessarily the most important thing there. And so he does so by contrasting the usefulness of tongues in the congregation to that of prophesying. So, to help us better understand what's going on here, we always need to understand the context of the letter and to look at the statements that he's making, look at the things surrounding, what's going on and why is he making that statement. This chapter is used by many false teachers today as a way to show that, what they consider speaking in tongues today is actually a modern spiritual gift. We've talked about several times how that when you go into denominations today and people are claiming to speak in tongues, that these are languages which cannot be understood, or they really are no language. So it's not really speaking in tongues. And some will take these passages that we're about to study and say, see, it says that you can't understand, and so we'll look at some of those things. But in order to help us see through these false doctrines, we really need to understand the context. One thing we need to understand is that this letter was written to a congregation who probably all spoke the same language. So you go into this church at Corinth, they're living in the same city, the same country. Someone living in that town probably would be able to speak the local language there. And so, even if it was a foreigner, then, they, as a way of just living your day-to-day life, is going to learn the language that is spoken in that area. And so, coming into this congregation and someone having the ability to speak another language, just pertaining to that particular congregation there at Corinth, would not be that useful. The same as, this congregation. Suppose, a preacher comes in or someone comes in and he's speaking German. That's really not going to be of much use to the congregation here, is it? As it pertains to our worship service. And so we need to understand there that this group of people, in all likelihood, understood the same language. This letter was not written to a missionary in a foreign field. Therefore, Paul is not saying speaking in tongues is totally useless. He even goes as far as to say in the first part of verse 5, I wish you all spoke in tongues. But what he is saying is it's just not as useful in a group or in a congregation where there is no trouble communicating as prophecy would be. Because there, as he finishes up verse 5, it says, but even more that you prophesy, for he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks in tongues. So, Paul was, he said, I wish everybody had that ability. That's a good ability. But when it comes to, what is more useful here in Corinth, that this congregation is not speaking in tongues. It's that you all, it's prophecy. And we're going to look at why prophecy is more useful. So we see that the usefulness of each spiritual gift would change depending on the circumstances surrounding the application of that gift. And so, as we said, one spiritual gift that someone was using in a congregation would, its usefulness would probably be vastly different than someone going into another country trying to teach unbelievers. And so that's what I believe Paul is going to point out there. Where would tongues be of more use? Here? If someone here, say, was able to speak in tongues, would it be of more use here, or would it be of more use going over into Africa with some of the brethren there and teaching and preaching? It would be of more use in Africa, would it not? As we said, suppose someone came into this assembly speaking another language other than English. He gets up and he begins preaching. Some of us may have some knowledge of foreign languages, but as a whole, is that going to edify the congregation for someone to preach a sermon, in French? It wouldn't do me any good. Some of you may have studied French some in high school, but I don't know of anyone here that is fluent in French. And so it's probably not going to edify us very, very much. And then we see that tongues were for the unbeliever and not for the believer. And we'll skip ahead just a little bit. I thought it was good to point this out. He brings this out in a little bit later in the chapter, but as we go through this, I think it's important for us to note that. And so, we drop down in verse 22 where he says, "Therefore tongues are for a sign, not for those who believe, but to the unbelievers. But prophesying is not for unbelievers, but for those who believe." And so there again, you have the church at Corinth. What is a church? It's a group of believers. It's the called out. And so, tongues, as he says here, is really is not for those who believe. It's for the unbelievers. And so when you go into a congregation and you say, I'm more important in this congregation because I can speak in tongues, Paul's like, no, not so. Not so, because that's for unbelievers. Therefore, within the church, speaking in tongues would not go far in edifying the congregation. Anybody have any comments or anything so far there? As we continue looking at our text there, we see that in a group of people who speak the same language, the message remains a mystery if it's being spoken in tongues. We'll go ahead and reread verse 2 there. It says, "For he who speaks a tongue does not speak to men but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries." And so, this is one of the passages here that people use as far as trying to prove modern day speaking in tongues. But, basically, what Paul is stating here is that if someone comes into the congregation speaking in tongues and no one understands him, basically the only person that understands him would be God, because no one else has that ability to understand that language. So God alone understands. And of course, the implication of this, as we said, is that there's no other person there able to understand that language. So, he might have some important information to present, but yet it remains a mystery because no one's there to interpret. And so, we've all probably seen movies or read stories or whatever about someone who had some important information and maybe he wasn't able to speak, or he spoke the wrong language and he was trying to get that across to someone else. How hard that was. There's important information, but yet it's of no good until we find a way to impart that information to those who need it. So in contrast, the prophet gives a message men can understand, which edifies, exhorts, consoles. All of this is the prophet has the ability to do this because he's giving information from God that is understood. And since it can be understood, then it can edify, it can exhort, it can console, it can warn, it can do all these things. And so in a congregation, which is more important? Someone speaking words that cannot be understood, or someone speaking words which has the power to do all these things we just said? You know, you look at maybe the prophet and the one that speaks in tongues, you know, they get up and they say the same message. Which one is going to be of more use? You know, they're saying the exact same thing. But in this congregation, which would be of more use? The one that can be understood, correct? And so that's the point that Paul is trying to get across here. As we said at the beginning of our lesson, you know, the key to a very important part of our worship and what we do this morning and every time we come together is exhortation. And if we look at this chapter, you know, Paul reminds the Corinthians of this all throughout the chapter. You know, 6 times he reminds the assembly of the purpose of the assembly being edification. You look at chapter 14, verse 5, that the church may receive edification. We drop down into verse 12. Let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. Verse 17, for you indeed give thanks well, but the other is not edified. Verse 26, let all things be done for edification. Verse 33, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. And of course here he's stressing that, you know, confusion does not edify. And then in verse 40, let all things be done decently and in order. And so the question we are asking is, what edifies? What edifies the congregation? And of course, we've said that several times. Any comments or anything there before we move on in our text?
Shane, just, I don't want to throw you off course, but, you know, spiritual gifts and let me say speaking in tongues, I mean, people that do that today, or that say they do that, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, are they just caught up in the moment, or are they, obviously, you know, we know it's not there, but they think it is. I mean, what do you think's going on with those people today?
I don't know. I mean, we can't really judge the heart of a person.
No,
but I do believe that there are some who know that they're not speaking in tongues and are pretending to do so. But having said that, I think emotions and you know, the way, from what I understand, these services go and people, you know, they're very emotional and they're designed to get people stirred up. You know, I do believe that there are some who you know, get to that point where they start doing this and maybe they do believe that they're actually speaking in tongues. I don't know. But, you know, emotions can play a big role in things that we do and get us to believing things that aren't true. And that's why, you know, we've talked many times here about how we need to take emotions out of the picture. You know, emotions are important, but we don't, when it comes to things that we are doing, I mean, emotions may prompt us to do something. We may, you know, love is an emotion. And we saw how important love was last week. But, you know, love prompts us to do these things, and we understand that those things are good. And you know, but our so-called love may prompt us maybe to not discipline our children in our minds. And so that emotion, what we're calling love, causes us to do something. Our children need discipline, but yet we fail to do that because of this emotion. And so we need to check our emotions. But you know, I've said all that to say that, you know, I don't know. I mean, some people I think may be honest, but I could be wrong. Anybody else have anything they would like to say about that? Some in here may have more experience in that line than I do. But, you know, I think there are sincere people probably in every denomination, but, you know, they just maybe they don't want to see the truth, or they, the emotions get a hold of them, or maybe it's just that family ties, things like that, get in the way, and they blind themselves maybe.
I think that's right.
Donnie.
Shane, in 2 Thessalonians, I think this principle would apply in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11. For this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie, and that they all may be condemned that did not know the truth but had pleasure in their own righteousness. I think the idea that when some person is so deceived and so deluded that they believe it.
Yeah.
Not saying they're doing it, but maybe they believe they're doing it.
Yeah.
And then maybe their out is, well, nobody can understand it because I'm speaking to God, and you can't understand it. So there's no justification.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's right, but I'm trying to explain why other people may believe that.
Yeah, I believe that's true. That's a good passage there. It Rex.
When you don't have a true love for the truth, which people, that teach all kinds of garbage, say they have a love for the truth, then you're open to all kinds of error that you can be deceived by.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, we got to be careful ourselves.
Yeah.
We desire the truth.
Yeah.
We want it. We don't care what we think or how we feel. We want to search to know that we have it.
Yeah, and at the very end, I think I have this passage toward the end of the lesson, but talking about worshiping God in spirit and in truth. Emotions play a part, but we need to make sure that truth is in there, and our emotions can lead us to do a lot of different things, and we need to make sure that our emotions are taking us to the proper place, because we are emotional creatures, and you look at the services that I haven't been to a denominational service in a long time, but just seeing what you see on TV and things that people share different places, much of what's being done in the religious world today is geared toward emotions and getting people worked up, the bands and the lights and all of that stuff that really plays to people's emotions, and it gets people worked up, and so that leads them down the wrong road. We need to be emotional creatures, but we need to worship God in spirit and in truth, and that's key there. We don't need to be emotionless, because that leads us down a totally different road. But we need to control our emotions, and we need to understand, we need to have truth behind our emotions. Anybody else wants to say there? All right, so as we continue on there, we see how in this next section we're going to be looking at how that tongues without a message are meaningless. So we begin reading there as we continue in verse 6. It says, "But now, brethren, if I come to you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you unless I speak to you either by revelation, by knowledge, by prophesying, or by teaching? Even things without life, whether flute or harp, when they make a sound, unless they make a distinction in the sounds, how will it be known what is piped or played? For if the trumpet makes a certain sound, who will prepare for battle? So likewise, unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air. There are, it may be, so many kinds of languages in the world, and none of them is without significance. Therefore, if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he who speaks will be a foreigner to me. Even so you, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. Therefore let him who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful." So we see here that speaking in another language doesn't profit another person if there is no meaningful message to be presented. And, this just reiterates what we've already said several times this morning. If the other person, does not understand the language being used, then there's no information being imparted, there's no edification, it's just nonsense to them. In order for speech to edify a congregation, there needs to be at least one of these things that Paul mentions. There needs to be revelation. Well, what is revelation? Well, it's an insight into something not realized before. If you have a revelation, you understand something that you didn't understand before that revelation, correct? So, if speech is going to edify, well, maybe it might be a revelation. It could be knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge, that's facts to fill in the gaps in what a person understands. So I understand certain things, and someone imparts a piece of knowledge to me, and so maybe that fills in the gaps. So now I understand more perfectly. Maybe that leads me to a revelation, something along those lines. You have prophecy, which is a presentation of God's will. God is speaking through this prophet, this person. Or you can have doctrine, and this is instruction or teaching from God. And so, for speech to be of any use to a congregation, it would need to fall into one of these four categories, basically is what Paul is stating. And so someone speaking in tongues, is not really, people really get nothing out of it. They get none of these four things because it just cannot be understood. And, as far as us today, we need to notice that really only one of those things, prophecy, would be something that we really couldn't do today because we don't have spiritual gifts. As Christians today, we could use the scriptures to do all of these other things. And as we read earlier, when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away with. We have that which is perfect now. And so we can take that which is perfect, which is God's revealed word in the scriptures that we have. We all have a copy, I'm sure, probably multiple copies. And so we can take those things and then we can go to others and we could reveal things to them. We could impart knowledge. We could teach them the doctrine that is taught in the scriptures. And so we can still do these things, and we can use what God has given us to edify the congregation here. Any comments along those lines?
Yeah, I want to make this just because I think it's important as it relates to the covering. See, I've always thought that this section proved the covering, like knowledge. The knowledge he's talking about would cease, but it doesn't. See, it's still with us. Mm-hmm. But there was inspired, not see, whether there be knowledge, it shall cease. Whether there be prophecies, it shall fail. Yeah. Like he's talking about just the inspired aspect of it, not the thing itself. Yeah. That's why I think, one, we do prophesy today, because what ceased, what you're talking about, was that was given directly from God. But what about, like, not, in other words, to be consistent, you go down through there and he says knowledge fails, prophecies, the tongues, all these things that would fail, but they're still tongues. It's just not the one that he would, he didn't give me Chinese, but they're still Chinese. And so I've always just thought that was that this strengthens the covering argument when people try to nullify it based on the fact that we don't prophesy today. Yeah. And we come back and say, well, what about all these other things that would cease? They still exist. Okay. And so why wouldn't prophecy still exist? Just not the kind where God would give it to you, if that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. I've never really thought of it that way, but that's very interesting. Anybody else have anything along those lines? All right, so Paul uses musical instruments as a way to kind of illustrate this point. If an instrument is played without a melody, where all of these
notes are put in distinctive orders and played in the distinctive way, then no one would know what the melody was. I'm sure all of us maybe have heard a child playing the piano or playing another musical instrument, and they go in there and they bang on that and they say, you know, Mama, Daddy, what song am I playing? And you're like, I don't know. What song are you playing? And until they tell you what song they're playing, you don't understand. You don't know. And so, you know, you have to be told what the song is. Why? Because they're not playing in a distinctive manner. They're not putting those notes and everything in the proper order, in the proper time, and so therefore, you don't know. And that's basically, you know, what Paul is saying. You know, unless someone plays in a particular way, then you're not really going to get what they are playing. Then another illustration is that maybe of a trumpeter or a bugler in an army. You know, if the sounds that are being blown are not distinct, so that the message being sent is clear, you know, an army would not know whether he's saying to charge or whether he's saying to retreat. And so this was very important on the battlefield throughout much of our history, is, you know, a way for the army to know what's going on over these distances of the battlefield, where all this is, you know, all the clamor and the yelling and screaming and stuff like that. You had to have this guy blowing this trumpet so people could understand and could hear. But if that's not a distinctive melody, I guess, for lack of a better word, that this guy's playing, then the army's going to be very confused. You know, if he's supposed to be playing the retreat and he plays, I don't know, Dixie or something like that, I don't know. You know, the army's not going to know what's going to happen, what's supposed to happen. And so it's going to confuse everybody, and things are going to be overlooked. And it's going to cause a lot of problems. So, you know, in the same way, if the speaker in another language doesn't speak in a clear and understandable way, so, you know, taking in consideration the people that he is speaking to, then the people is really not going to benefit the people he's speaking to. The listeners will not understand. They're going to be confused. The tongue speaker might as well just be speaking into the air. It would be as if the speaker and the hearer were foreigners to each other. Remember what we read there in verse 11, therefore if I do not know the meaning of the language, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he who speaks will be a foreigner to me. It'll be just like we're foreigners. And some of us have traveled in other countries where we don't speak the language. And at times, it can be a very frustrating thing. You know, when we were in Ukraine, we ended up eating at McDonald's a good bit. You know why? Because they had those little kiosks there that we could hit English, and then we could order our food. And it was just so much easier. It was just like, yeah, we really want something, but let's just go to McDonald's because we're tired of this hassle. We try to communicate with people that really don't understand us. And so it becomes frustrating. People, you know, get aggravated, you know, things of that nature. I'm sure we've all dealt with people that speak another language. And so it's just not easy. You know, confusion very often is the result. You know, at work, I deal with people a lot of times that speak Spanish, and I can speak Spanish to a certain degree, but you know, it's difficult for me in the morning to tell them in Spanish, now today I want you to go over here. When you get that finished, you remember what we did yesterday, let's go over there and do, you know, I can't do that. You know, I have to take them and show them and things like that, because we have issues communicating. And even though I can speak some, it can be frustrating at times. And a lot of times things don't get done like I would like for them to get done because there's that communication gap. And so things, you know, wrong things get done. and we have to correct those things. Any other comments or anything there? Paul encourages the Corinthians to be zealous for spiritual gifts, but not to lose sight of what using those gifts could mean for the church, what benefits the church. And as we've said there, edification is key. Verse 12, even so, you, since you are zealous for spiritual gifts, let it be for the edification of the church that you seek to excel. There's nothing wrong with seeking to excel. You know, my grandfather, he told me, I don't know how many times, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. You know, we want to excel in what we do. Anything I do, I want to do it right. And so there's nothing wrong with seeking to excel, but why? Why do we want to seek to excel? We want to edify and to help others. It's not, again, for our self-promotion. The need to excel first and foremost in building up the church. If a person speaks in another language, he needs to also pray that he can properly, clearly, and accurately translate that or get his point across to the people that he is speaking to. I need, if I'm speaking another language, then what's the purpose behind that? Paul is, again, not saying that someone with the gift of languages cannot demonstrate his ability to speak other languages, but that demonstration cannot be solely for showing off. There's got to be a purpose behind that. He must first think about benefiting his listeners with a message that they can understand. Again, if a person who prays in another language unknown to those around him, and no one else knows what he's saying, what benefit is that to the people that are listening to him? It really bears no fruit in the congregation there. And so we'll go ahead and close up our lesson for this morning, but we'll pick up there around verse 15 and continue looking at, what the goal of those who are leading worship, what their goal should be. And of course, that is to teach and to edify. So we'll pick up, Lord willing, next week in verse 19. I appreciate everyone's attention and those who have commented. Thank you.